All right, I am so excited. We are in chapter 8. Yes, part of that is because it's no longer chapter 7. But let me tell you that I'm also very excited because it is chapter 8. And I was telling Dan earlier, the deeper I got into this study, the more excited I was about the things that I see that Paul has done with words, concepts, ideas. And hopefully I can at least get you excited to see some of those things yourself. The What we saw back in chapter 7 was really the first one of the series of questions that the church in Corinth had sent to Paul. The first question, of course, dealt with celibacy and divorce, remarriage. And we talked about that the last several weeks. The second question seems to be a question really just asking about meat that was offered to idols. Partly, we need to kind of talk just a little bit about the background of Corinth. This would have been true for most of the churches of Southwest Asia. What happened in these Roman cities, these Greek Roman cities? What kind of culture did they live in? What kind of practices did they have? Indulgence, that's one term. Yep, absolutely. And I guess maybe the question is, where was a lot of this indulgence? What did it center around? Yeah, temples, plural. There were multiple temples, especially in large cities like Corinth. There would have been idols all through the city. And a big thing about those practices, those worship practices, is that food was a big part of that. But that's not terribly uh, terribly different than what would have gone on. Even as we go back to the Old Testament, I mean, look what happened when they dedicated the temple. When Solomon dedicated the temple, the numbers are just astronomical. The number of bulls and goats and sheep that were sacrificed, that food's got to be consumed. People were having feasts and eating high on the hog. It was Thanksgiving for many days as they were celebrating the dedication of the temple. Well, the same sort of thing was happening in Corinth, the same sort of thing happened in Athens, same sort of thing happened in Ephesus and all these places. Not all of it was eaten right away. What would they do with the excess meat that was left over? What does any good businessman do? Find a market for it. Exactly. And so this meat was being sold in the marketplace. Now, are there certain cuts of meat that command a higher price than others? Well, sure. What makes it more valuable? That kind of depends maybe where it comes from the cow, but also there's some marketing involved. Once somebody says, "Oh, I had this cut of meat, it's really, really good." Next time you go to the store, you're probably going to get that cut of meat, even if you've never had it before. What else could make something very valuable? Grass-fed, grain-fed, organic. There's a lot of different labels you can put on things, and what will that do? Make it more valuable, raise the price for people who care about that particular label. What kind of label might have made something more valuable in Corinth? It was sacrificed to whichever particular god. And depending on what your flavor is of God, you might pay more for that. That seems to be what the question that was being sent to Paul. Not asking him which God's meat should we buy, because one of the things we talked about in the first class, what was the cultural composition of the church in Corinth? It's a mixture of different kinds of people. What's the biggest contrast that you would have found? Jew and Gentile, exactly. How would a Jew feel about eating meat that had been sacrificed to Zeus? Yeah, that's not going to be, I'm not paying extra for that. In fact, I'm not buying that. But they're invited to a Gentile's house to have dinner. I wonder where this meat came from. Now they're starting to understand there's some questions that are making people uncomfortable. There's situations that they don't really know how to deal with. Maybe they even know this Gentile just bought a cut of meat at the market that was labeled as being sold or sacrificed to Zeus. And they're thinking, they shouldn't buy that. What are they going to do? That's the kind of questions that it appears that the church in Corinth has sent to Paul. Can we eat the meat that's been sacrificed to idols? Now, when you have questions, what kind of an answer do you want to get? What's the easiest answer of all? It's either yes or no. Isn't that the easiest answer to get? Just tell me yes or no. I get that all the time from people. Does Paul answer this question, yes or no? Well, I think we know the answer is no, he doesn't. He's not going to tell them yes or no. But that's what's exciting about this. I think he gives them a much better answer than yes or no. Let's talk very quickly again about what is the theme of the book of Corinthians. We are called into what? Fellowship. Fellowship is sharing together. Does that mean sharing meals together? Sharing lives together? Absolutely. So this question is a very important question. Can we eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols? But it's such an important question that it really can't be answered by yes or no. Instead, what Paul says, we know that we all have knowledge. That doesn't sound like yes or no to me. In fact, why does he start by saying we all have knowledge? Well, we do all have knowledge, don't we? Some have more than others, but everybody knows something. We talked earlier, Adam mentioned the idea that this would make a Jew very uncomfortable. Why? Well, they've got knowledge. They've got a knowledge of what God said to the people of Israel. They've got a knowledge about what they feel about meat that's been sacrificed to idols. And the Gentile has knowledge. They have knowledge about what their background is. They have knowledge about what this meat might be. Paul says we all have knowledge. But then what does he say about knowledge? What does knowledge do? Yeah, it causes one to be prideful. Knowledge, Paul says, puffs up. It makes us bigger in our own minds. And what's the contrast with that? Love edifies. Now, let's talk first of all about knowledge. If I just took those two sentences, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. What do you think about knowledge? If that's the only thing you know. Knowledge is bad. Yeah, exactly. Knowledge is bad. But is that really the message of the Bible? Is knowledge bad? Don't we tell people that you need to study the scriptures? Doesn't Paul tell or Peter tell us at the end of his second letter, grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? Knowledge is not bad. In fact, knowledge is good. Even in the Old Testament, it talks about in Jeremiah 29, the prophecy that would, excuse me, Jeremiah 31, the prophecy of the covenant that would come. And Jeremiah said, not everyone will say to their neighbor, know the Lord, because everyone will know the Lord in their heart. Knowledge is good. Knowledge is bad. We're already starting to see that it's not a simple yes or no answer. What we're going to see is Paul is going to be contrasting knowledge and love as it answers this question. And spoiler alert, it's also going to answer the questions you and I face. Now, I've never had a problem with knowing whether I could eat meat offered to idols or not. Never been a temptation to me, and never seen that in the marketplace. So that's just never been an issue that I've ever dealt with in my life. Some people's concept of the Bible is that 1 Corinthians 8 doesn't mean anything to you at all. No, what we need to understand is how Paul says this applies, the idea of knowledge and love, to that question. It applies the same to those questions that I do deal with on a regular basis. And what we're going to see is that Paul tells us what knowledge says about this question and what love says about this question. And then he's going to really show us how that applies. He kind of goes through this in two different levels. First of all, just kind of gives us a basic answer from knowledge, an answer from love, and then he goes deeper into showing how that exhibits itself. So let's first of all talk about just simply what knowledge says. In verse 2, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he is not yet known as he ought to know. Now, when Paul says anyone supposes he knows anything, he just said we all have knowledge. So everybody does know something. But what does Paul tell us? If you know something, what should that tell you? Something I've learned as I've grown more mature in my understanding of the Bible. Yeah, there's a whole lot more that I still have to learn. So whatever I know now, all that does is just open up a vista for me to show there's so much more there that I don't know yet. And I think that's part of what Paul is getting at. Knowledge is good. Just recognize that what knowledge you have now is not complete. And so it's not the answer to everything, because you don't know everything yet. So you have not known as you ought to know. But he says, in contrast to that, if anyone loves God, what? God knows him. And that's a fascinating contrast. I want you to notice some of the contrasts that we've seen just in these first three verses. First of all, let's go back to this idea: knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. There's two contrasts that Paul just really nails here. First of all, he said, love puffs up. Who is love elevating? You see him every day in the mirror. Knowledge elevates me. I'm puffed up. Who does love elevate? Everyone else, exactly. Love edifies. The implied object there is everyone else. So here's one contrast. Knowledge lifts me up. Love is lifting everyone else up. But look at the other contrast. Look at the verb itself. Knowledge puffs up. You've seen those things that you put out in your yard during holidays. It's got a little fan under it and that lifts up and does all sorts of weird things as the air's blowing through it. What happens when you shut off the fan? It deflates, it collapses. You build a tower. How long is it going to last? The verbs that Paul uses here, puffs up, the word edified literally means to build up. Which one's longer lasting? Has a greater effect. Fascinating contrast that Paul talks about here. Then the one in verse 3. Notice he said, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, that's what I know. But what does he say? If anyone loves God, then what does it say? God knows him. Is there a difference in what I know and what God knows? You can't get any greater difference than that. But notice what else he's saying here. What is it that I know from verse 2? If he knows anything, what does God know? What's the object of God's knowledge? People, me. Would you rather know things or rather know people? Souls. I love these contrasts that Paul is showing them. He's showing them the difference between knowledge and love. Not that knowledge is bad or evil, but what he's trying to show them is love is so much more than knowledge. Yes, we should study our Bibles. We should learn more about God's Word. I hope that's what we're doing right now. We're learning more. But what I hope we learn will lead us to understand love. Because these are really motivations that Paul is talking about. Their question, is it all right to eat meat offered to idols, yes or no? That's really only a motivation of knowledge. Am I right or is he right? Do I know better or does he know better? That's why Paul won't answer that question, yes or no. Instead, Paul wants them to understand, I want you to understand what you need to be thinking about the person that you may disagree with. I want you to be thinking about how that you can lift them up. Even if they're wrong about this particular issue, how can you lift them up? How can you show God in the way you treat them? Any questions then down through verse 3? What I like, even with the stuff we've talked about so far, is we've just hit the surface stuff. Now Paul's going to get deeper. Now what he's going to do is he's going to telling us what knowledge says about this issue. So he says in verse 4, therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols. Okay, now we're going to get Paul to tell us what does knowledge say. It's fascinating to me. The same thing is true in Romans 14, where he was talking about kind of the same sort of issue. The church in Rome also dealt with feast days and a variety of different questions. There's only one verse in that chapter where Paul says, this is what the truth is. Out of 23 verses, there's only one verse where Paul says, this is what the truth is. Everything else he says in Romans 14 is how you act in love towards your brother. Well, in this case, we're going to have 3 verses that tell us what knowledge says. But the rest of the chapter is telling us how we're to act in love towards one another. So he says there in verse 4, we know there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and there is no God but one. So if we're talking about whether it's right to eat meat that's been offered to idols or not, Paul says there is no such thing as an idol or what it represents. Sure, there's a physical form there. Somebody's carved something or formed something. But there is no God that it represents. It has no reality behind it. So you can imagine some of the people reading this part of the letter thinking, I was right. Paul will deal with them in just a minute. But he says, there is but one God. This actually kind of is saying to both the Jew and the Gentile, you're both right. The Jew would understand there is but one God. The Gentile would say, but this is just me. And Paul says, yeah, you're both right. He says, even if there are so-called gods, and whether in heaven or earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father. But he's going to go more than just simply saying there's one God. What does he says about this God? He is the source, the origin of all things, especially what? Or maybe I should say especially whom? Me. He's the originator of me, the source of me. So if I'm trying to figure out how to act in this life, where do I need to start? Not what I know, but what God knows. There is one Lord, who is through all things, through whom are all things, and we exist through him. I started at the beginning of the lesson reminding you of the theme of the book of Corinthians. Now you see why. Paul is bringing us back to the same thing. God is the originator of all things. We are created through Christ. We exist through him. So whenever we're talking about this question or any other question, we always have to go back to where it starts. What does God think? What does God feel? What does God want us to be doing? So the answer to the question, what does knowledge say? Well, knowledge says there is no such thing as an idol. We have one God, we have one Lord. Okay, easy answer. We got that solved, don't we? But Paul says at the beginning of verse 7, however, I'm going to drop down and pick up what he says in verse 9. Take care lest this liberty of yours. And I want to focus on that word liberty. Then we'll come back to picking up verse 7 to see what comes after the however. How does the Bible use the term liberty? Is it an important part of Christianity? Yeah, very important. I mean, I've got a bunch of passages up here. We're not going to read every one of them. The word liberty comes from a Greek word that literally just means the right to exist. Its actual root is the Greek to be or not to be. Authority is basically saying yes, to be. It's the right to exist. We use it often when we get in debates over, whether it's right to do this or wrong to do that. Does God authorize this to do? And it's an important debate to have. It's an important discussion to have because it ultimately comes down to the idea, do I want to do what is pleasing to God? Has God given the right to do that? So it's an important thing to consider. It's used in a very positive sense in many ways. Jesus told the Jews in John chapter 8, if you abide in my word, you know the truth will set you free. Truth gives you liberty. He goes on to say it sets you free from sin and death. So yeah, liberty is a very important part of Christianity. It is our freedom from sin. It's our freedom from what Satan has bound us by through our temptation, through our sin. We find in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 16, there were some Jews, Jewish Christians, who were trying to force Titus to be circumcised. Titus was a Greek Christian. And there were some who were trying to say Titus has to be circumcised to be able to be a Christian, to be able to work among us. And what does Paul say about that? That I won't give an inch. I will not give an inch on that. Paul dug his heels in and said, no, he is not going to be circumcised just because you said so. He would not let people impose their will on him. I'm sorry, it's Galatians 2, verses 3 and 5, where that is. Jesus had talked to the Pharisees. Dana and I were talking about this before class started. Jesus told his disciples, the things that they're teaching you are true, but the things that they're binding upon you, they're trying to impose their will. And don't give in to that. Don't let that be your authority. Let your liberty be that from God. So liberty is a very good word in the New Testament, the Old Testament for that matter. Liberty is essentially our right to exist, our right to serve our God. It's the freedom that we have to be able to serve him. So I can see where Paul starts this phrase with, however, he just basically said, we have freedom to eat this meat. There is no such thing as an idol. There is no rule that that meat is tainted. However, so what is the however? Well, he starts by saying, however, not all men have this knowledge. It would be so easy if we all had the same knowledge. If we all knew exactly the same things, we would all be in agreement all the time. Have you ever found that place? I guess they call that utopia, but it doesn't exist in reality. We don't all have that knowledge. Paul says, look at your own backgrounds. There are some that meat offered to idols, they may have paid extra for that last year, last month. Now they've been baptized into Christ. Does all of their past just simply get wiped away because of that? Their sins have been wiped away. But is their conscience, their culture, is all of that just suddenly changed into this? Or maybe a Jew who would look at that same meat and find it repugnant. Does it now look tasty? Just because they've been baptized into Christ? Paul says not all men have that knowledge. Not everybody is in the same place here. So as you're looking at this question that they want a yes or no answer to, Paul says there isn't a yes or no answer. Because not everybody's in the same place. And it's not he's just simply saying, well, the answer for this Greek Christian is different than the answer for this Jewish Christian. He's saying the answer is different for you depending on who you are with. What circumstance it might be. I mentioned earlier the fact that somebody tried to compel Titus to be circumcised and Paul would not give an inch. What did he do with Timothy? He had him circumcised as soon as he started to take him with him to preach. And the context tells us because everyone knew his father was a Greek. So even for Paul, depending on the circumstance, the answer is different. Because the situation is different. Was Paul being wishy-washy? No. In fact, what Paul was doing was acting out of love. Where it would benefit the cause of Christ, he had Timothy circumcised. Where it would do detriment to the cause of Christ, where somebody was trying to oppose their own laws, Paul absolutely refused. It all had to do with the circumstance, the situation. And that's why I said that very rarely is a simple yes or no the answer. So he says, however, here in verse 7, not all men have this knowledge. Some being accustomed to the idol now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol. And their conscience being weak is defiled. That really sets the foundation for what Paul's going to talk about the rest of the chapter. I don't want to rush into it because I don't want to rush through it. But I want you to think about that circumstance, that situation, where you're putting someone in a situation where their conscience would be defiled. I do want to look at one thing. If somebody could look at Romans 14, we mentioned that earlier. I want you to notice the very last verse. Somebody could read chapter 14 and verse 23.
But whoever doubts stands condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and everything that is not from faith is sin.
Everything that is not from faith. Notice Paul here isn't saying that the eating of meat itself is a sin or is not a sin. That wasn't the answer from Romans 14. It's not the answer here. The answer is, are you living by your faith? And in Romans 14, he's kind of dealing it from the viewpoint of the person who's making that decision. What we're looking at in 1 Corinthians 8 is looking at it from the person who's influencing the one who's making that decision. If I influence somebody to sin, what have I done? I've made him stumble. Let's look at one more passage, then we'll stop. Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18, if somebody could read the first 4 verses. I'm sorry, verses 5 and 6, excuse me. Verses 5 and 6 of Matthew 18. Mm-hmm. All right, so what does it mean to receive one of these? Freedom with love. Show love in the way that I treat them. But what is it? What's the opposite of that? As we see here in 1 Corinthians 8, I can be right. And by being right, I can be wrong. So I want you to keep that thought in mind as we get into next week. You can be right, and in being right, you can be wrong.